Welcome to the deep dive. You know, we all wrestle with these huge questions sometimes, don't we?
That's
like,
true.
why are we even here? Or what's this all about? It just seems, well, fundamentally human to ask.
It really does. It's woven through history, through philosophy. People are always searching for that meaning, that place in the cosmos.
And today, we're diving right into that search. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore the arguments, for and against a divine creator. And we're going to do that mainly through the lens of Islamic thought, using a book called The Divine Reality from the Sapiens Institute.
It's a really interesting source.
Yeah, we want to unpack its core ideas, the history behind them, and, well, the big existential questions it raises. Think of this as your guide through some pretty complex territory.
And it's probably helpful to mention a couple of things from the book right off the bat. Context, really.
Okay.
You'll hear a specific phrase used for the Prophet Muhammad, "May God's peace and blessings be upon him." It's an honorific, a sign of respect. And also the name Allah. It's not like a different God. It's the Arabic name for the one God, the deity. It's genderless, unique.
That's a really crucial point, yeah. Thanks for clarifying. What's also quite compelling is the author's own story mentioned in the book.
Right, the intellectual conviction versus the emotional connection.
Exactly. Intellectually on board, but feeling a bit disconnected emotionally at first. And the book kind of tries to bridge that gap.
It does. And it mentions the author even studied Christian philosophy initially, partly because accessible Islamic texts in English were, well, harder to come by back then.
Despite, as the author says, the huge and subtle differences between the faiths.
Yeah, which really highlights why accessible explanations like this are so important.
So where do we start digging in?
Well, the book tackles a foundational question first. What is atheism really? And, where does it actually come from?
Okay, seems simple, but I bet it's complex.
It is. The book lays out a few different ways to understand it. First, just as a negative thing. Someone who simply doesn't believe in a god or gods.
Right, not necessarily making a big claim, just not believing.
Exactly. Then there's a view that's maybe closer to agnosticism. It's where someone just doesn't find the arguments for God convincing enough.
Okay, so less God doesn't exist and more I'm not persuaded.
Precisely. And then you have the positive assertion, the claim that no gods actually exist.
Right.
And the book argues that position needs its own justification, its own argument. It isn't just the default.
That's interesting. And the book also brings up something called misotheism.
Yeah, misotheism. It means hatred of God. It's quite intense.
Hatred.
But the source, referencing Schweitzer, suggests it's not always just like pure negativity. It can stem from what it calls admirable humanistic impulses.
Really? How so?
Well, when someone's deeply wounded psychologically, emotionally, maybe by experiencing or witnessing terrible suffering, and they question God's role in it, it can be a reaction against perceived injustice.
Okay, I can see how that could happen. So turning to the Islamic perspective, how does it view atheism, especially this idea of it being a deviation?
The Islamic term used is ilhad. Linguistically, it comes from lahad, which is like a niche or side pocket dug into the side of a grave.
A side pocket.
Yeah, implying a deviation, a turning away from the main path. So ilhad means godlessness or deviation.
So the idea is that?
According to teachings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad, it implies atheism is a departure from our natural innate state, what's called the fitra, which is believed to include an inherent acknowledgement of God.
So it's seen as moving away from something fundamental within us. That's a powerful way to frame it. How does this play out historically?
Well, in Islamic history, the book mentions the 8th century Dariya. They were basically empiricists.
Empiricists, meaning?
Meaning they believed only what they could observe. They thought the cosmos was eternal, no creator needed, everything just was.
And how were they received?
Major scholars like Abu Hanifa and especially Al-Ghazali really challenged them intellectually. Al-Ghazali called them reductionists. He had this great analogy.
Yeah.
Like ants on a piece of paper, only seeing the black ink of the letters, totally unaware of the hand and the mind doing the writing, focus only on the immediate physical.
That paints a picture. Okay, switching to Western history.
You see figures like Charles Bradlaugh in the 19th century. He fought really hard in Britain to make atheism, well, socially and politically acceptable.
A struggle for legitimacy.
Definitely. Then, early 20th century, you get the logical positivists.
Right, I've heard of them. Their main thing was
verification. They argued that only statements you can empirically verify tests through observation are actually meaningful. Anything else, like metaphysics or theology, basically nonsense.
That's a pretty strict criterion for meaning.
It really narrowed the scope of discussion. But interestingly, the book notes that more recently, maybe in the last few decades, God is making a comeback in academic philosophy.
Oh, why is that?
Partly due to science, actually. Things like the Big Bang Theory, which suggests the universe had a beginning. That naturally leads back to the question, what or who started it?
The beginning problem again.
Exactly. And it's also important, as the book points out, that atheism isn't monolithic.
Yeah.
Not all atheists agree with the new atheist approach.
Right. There are internal debates.
Yeah. Quotes philosopher Tim Crane, who felt some new atheist clones were untrue and their approach to world problems may be misguided.
Yeah.
So there's diversity within that viewpoint, too.
Okay, so we've mapped out atheism a bit. Now, the book dives into the consequences, right? If atheism is true, what follows? It uses the word bleak.
It does. It argues that if philosophical naturalism, the idea that only matter and energy exist, is true, it leads to some pretty stark existential and logical conclusions.
Like what, for instance?
Well, consider ultimate justice.
Yeah.
The book gives this harrowing example of a Jewish woman in Nazi Germany seeing her family killed, knowing she's next.
Oh, gosh.
If there's no God, no afterlife, where is the ultimate justice for her, for that kind of suffering? The uncomfortable answer the book suggests is nowhere. It just ends.
Yeah, that's bleak. And what about human value?
That's another major point. If we're all just, as naturalism might suggest, a complex rearrangement of matter, then what's the real difference ontologically between smashing a chocolate bunny and, well, harming a human?
Oof.
It questions the very basis for inherent human dignity, for human rights, for the idea that life is sacred. If value is just an illusion in our heads, a product of evolution,
Then it loses its subjective foundation.
exactly.
But couldn't someone push back and say, well, isn't God's value judgment just subjective too? His opinion?
That's a common objection, and the book addresses it. It clarifies that God's perspective isn't subjective like ours, based on limited feelings or whims. It's grounded in unlimited knowledge and wisdom. It's an absolute perspective, not a relative one.
Okay, I see the distinction. So if human value is questioned, what about the value of the world itself and our purpose within it?
Under an atheistic framework, the book describes the world as fundamentally transient and short-lived. It's temporary, ultimately meaningless in the grand cosmic sense, lacking inherent ultimate value.
It just is, and then it won't be.
Right. Contrast that with the Islamic view. This world is an abode for getting close to God, a place for good deeds, for worship, all leading towards an eternal paradise. It gives this temporary life profound, lasting significance.
That's a huge difference in perspective and purpose itself. I remember that Camus quote.
You will never live if you're looking for the meaning of life.
Yeah, that one, it fits here, doesn't it?
It really does capture the naturalist implication. If our existence is just the result of blind, random, and non-rational physical processes, well, then there's no inherent ultimate purpose designed for us.
We just happen.
We just happen. But Islam offers a very clear ultimate purpose, the worship of God. And worship here means something comprehensive, loving him, obeying him, getting to know him.
And how does that impact life?
The book argues this actually frees people, frees them from being enslaved to societal pressures or other people's expectations or even their own egos. It uses a Quranic illustration comparing a servant who has one good, clear master versus one trying to serve many conflicting masters.
Simplicity and focus versus chaos.
Exactly. It brings a singular focus and liberation. Reminds me of Richard Dawkins' famous line about the universe having no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Stark.
Very. And the book's counter is that only God provides the necessary intellectual justification for the things that truly define our humanity. Our sense of purpose, value, morality, justice.
Without that divine grounding, those things become shaky.
Arguably, yes.
Yeah.
They become preferences or perhaps useful social constructs, but not objective truths.
Okay, that lays out the stakes pretty clearly. Let's flip the coin now and look at the arguments for the divine that the book presents. It starts by questioning if atheism itself is irrational.
Yeah, it uses that taxi driver analogy.
Right, the blindfolded driver.
Exactly. Driving blindfolded is irrational if you want to get somewhere safely. The analogy suggests that relying only on science, while science is incredibly powerful, to explain everything, including reason itself, is similarly problematic. Science can't justify the validity of reason without using reason, which is circular.
So science is a great tool, but maybe not the only tool or the tool to explain the toolbox itself.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And beyond irrationality, the book argues atheism is somehow unnatural, that belief in God is more like a default setting.
How does it make that case?
It points to the sheer universality of belief across cultures and history. It's not just tied to one time or place, it's almost everywhere. The argument is that this universal belief suggests something deeper than just social conditioning.
An intuition.
Kind of.
Yeah.
And it brings in psychological studies. Research by people like Paul Bloom and Deborah Kellerman suggests young children naturally lean towards seeing design in the world and believing in a mind distinct from the mind-body dualism.
Even kids. Interesting.
Yeah, and other studies found that even adults, including non-religious ones, showed an automatic, almost subconscious tendency to endorse purposeful creation, especially when they didn't have time to consciously deliberate.
So an underlying default inclination towards seeing a designer.
That's the idea. It suggests it's an intuitive default we might have to consciously override.
Fascinating. Okay, let's get into one of the really classic arguments. The argument from dependency, or the cosmological argument. The dominoes analogy really helps here.
It does. Imagine that infinite chain of dominoes. For any of them to fall.
There has to be a first one.
Right. A first domino that wasn't knocked over by a previous one. An uncaused cause to start the whole sequence.
And applying that to the universe.
The universe, being dependent and having a beginning, as science like the Big Bang suggests, can't explain itself. It can't be an infinite regress of things causing other things. There must be, logically, an uncreated creator that initiated everything.
Something outside the chain.
Exactly. Like Abraham Varghese said, take your pick, God or universe. Something always existed. Something had to be the eternal starting point.
But then comes the immediate pushback. Okay, fine, but who created God? How does the book handle that?
It tackles it directly, calls it, perhaps a bit bluntly, a childish contention.
Ouch.
Because the argument is that God, by definition, is the uncreated eternal being. God isn't part of the created order subject to the laws of cause and effect. God is the source of that order. Asking who created the uncreated is like asking what's north of the North Pole. It misunderstands the definition.
It's a category error, basically.
Precisely. As Professor John Lennox puts it, a created God is a contradiction in terms.
Okay. So if we accept the logic of an uncreated creator, what can we logically deduce about its nature? What attributes must it have?
The book outlines a few. First, this creator must be knowing. Look at the universe. It runs on intricate, consistent laws. Gravity, electromagnetism, the nuclear forces. These aren't random. They're structured.
Laws imply a lawgiver.
And a lawgiver implies knowledge. The Quran says, indeed, God is of all things knowing. It fits the observation.
Okay, knowing. What else?
Powerful. Immensely powerful. Just think about the energy locked in the universe. The sheer number of atoms 10 to the power of 80, estimates say, or the power unleashed in nuclear reactions. This points to a source of immense amount of power. As the book says, failure is not a feature of omnipotence.
Makes sense. All-knowing, all-powerful. Anything else?
Will. The creator must possess will. Why? Because the creator is argued to be eternal, existing forever. But the universe began to exist at a specific point.
Right, the Big Bang.
So if the creator is eternal, but the creation isn't, it means the creator chose to create at a certain point. It wasn't an automatic, necessary process flowing from its nature. It was an act of will. Al-Ghazali said, he is the willer of all things that are.
Knowing, powerful, and having will. It's a compelling logical picture. Let's shift gears to another argument. Consciousness. This feels very personal, very immediate.
It really does. We're talking about phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah.
That's your inner subjective experience, the actual feeling of seeing red, the taste of chocolate, the awe of a sunset. It's exactly what it's like. Neuroscience is amazing at mapping the brain activity correlated with these experiences, but it struggles to explain the subjective experience itself. Why does this pattern of neurons firing feel like anything at all?
The hard problem of consciousness.
That's the one. And this is where Frank Jackson's thought experiment, Mary's room, comes in.
Ah, yes, Mary in the black and white room.
Right. She knows every single physical fact about color, all the wavelengths, how the brain processes them, everything. But she's never actually seen color.
Until she leaves the room.
And sees red for the first time. Jackson argues she learned something new, what it's like to see red. This suggests that physical facts are not all the facts. There's something more than just the physical information.
Even if some philosophers disagree on what she learns.
Right, like Lewar is suggesting she just gains a new way of conceptualizing old facts. But the core challenge remains that subjective quality seems distinct from the purely physical description.
So what's the conclusion the book draws from this?
It argues that our subjective consciousness, this inner awareness, clearly points to an all-aware being as its source. It connects this to the Islamic idea of the ruh, the soul or spirit, being fundamentally from God, an affair or command of God. Denying God, in this view, is almost like denying a fundamental part of our own conscious selves.
Wow. Okay, next up, the argument from design or divine precision. The toast analogy you mentioned earlier fits here, right?
Perfectly. If you wake up and find toast made exactly how you like it, you don't assume the bread just randomly toasted itself and the butter leaped on.
No, you assume someone made it for you.
Exactly. Or the alien greenhouse finding a complex, perfectly balanced ecosystem on another planet. You wouldn't just shrug and say, wow, lucky chance. Our intuition screams design when we see complex order serving a purpose.
And the universe is the ultimate example of complex order.
Arguably, yes. Einstein called it marvelously arranged. This argument focuses on the fine-tuning of the universe's physical constants and laws. Tiny changes in things like the strength of gravity or the charge of an electron, and life as we know it couldn't exist. It seems precision engineered for life.
Even people like Dawkins acknowledge the appearance of design, right?
Yes, he acknowledges the immense complexity and order, but attributes it to natural selection or other non-guided processes, dismissing the design hypothesis.
But the book really pushes back against just saying it was chance, doesn't it?
It does. It calls it intellectual double standards. We demand explanations for improbable events in daily life. We don't just accept chance for, say, a complex machine assembling itself. Why accept it for the entire universe, which is infinitely more complex?
What about the multiverse theory? That's often brought up as an alternative explanation for fine-tuning.
The book raises key objections. First, as we discussed, there's zero direct observational evidence for other universes. It's pure speculation at this point.
A hypothesis.
A hypothesis, yes. Second, it argues it's potentially unscientific because it posits unobservable entities, maybe requiring more faith than belief in God. And third, even if there was a multiverse-generating mechanism, wouldn't that mechanism itself need to be incredibly well-designed and fine-tuned to produce universes capable of supporting life?
So it just pushes the problem back a step?
Arguably, yes. The book favors Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the best. One God seems simpler than infinite, unobservable universes.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move to objective morality. This feels connected to the earlier discussion about value.
It is. The argument here is, if objective moral truths exist, things that are genuinely right or wrong, regardless of opinion or culture, like compassion being good and cruelty being evil, then God is the only rational foundation for that objective good.
Why the only foundation?
Because without a transcendent source, where does that objective ought come from? Evolution can explain why we might feel something is wrong. It might harm group survival, but not why it is objectively wrong in a deeper, binding sense. Society can agree on rules, but societies change. God, as an absolute unchanging source of good, provides that anchor.
And you mentioned the distinction between ontology and epistemology before.
Crucial here. Ontology is about the reality or foundation of morality, what makes something good. Epistemology is about how we know it, how do we learn right from wrong. The argument is about ontology. Even if an atheist knows murder is wrong, epistemology, the question is, what makes it objectively wrong ontology if there's no God?
So for an atheist who does believe in objective morals,
the book suggests they face a dilemma. Either they have to concede that God is the most logical foundation for those objective morals, or they have to somehow ignore their innate disposition and ultimately reduce morality to just subjective feelings or social agreements, losing its objective force.
The tough spot. Okay, lastly in this section, the argument from divine singularity, the oneness of God.
This flows logically from the other attributes. If the Creator is truly all-powerful, all-knowing,
then you only need one.
Exactly. One Creator is all that is required. Adding more gods doesn't add explanatory power. It just complicates things unnecessarily. Simplicity points to one.
And what defines this one true God?
Key characteristics. Must be intimate, not limited by physical needs or qualities, not dependent on anything else. And its nature and revelation must be internally and externally consistent. No contradictions. The Quran sums it up. There is nothing like unto him. Utterly unique, self-sufficient, consistent.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground on the arguments for God, but what about the big challenge? The problem of evil and suffering. How does Islam, according to the source, respond?
This is obviously a huge and deeply felt issue. The book stresses our epistemic limitations. Remember the child wanting whiskey?
Right, the child can't grasp the parent's wisdom.
Exactly. We can't fully grasp God's infinite wisdom. Atheistic arguments often focus on God's power and mercy, the book suggests, but neglect his wisdom, assuming we should be able to understand his reasons for allowing suffering. Islam suggests we often can't, from our limited perspective.
So what is the purpose of suffering from this viewpoint?
This life, this dunya, is seen as an arena of trials and tribulations. It's fundamentally a test. Suffering is part of that test, designed to cultivate virtues, patience, reliance on God, compassion, courage.
But why the test? And doesn't it require free will?
Absolutely. Free will is essential. Without the genuine choice between good and evil, the test is meaningless. Good and evil lose their significance. The book uses the example of charity at gunpoint. It has no moral worth because there was no free choice.
So the possibility of choosing evil is necessary for the choice of good to be meaningful.
That's the idea. And linked to this is the transience of worldly life. It's described as amusement and diversion, temporary. The real, lasting reality is the hereafter.
So suffering here is seen in the context of eternity.
Precisely. From an Islamic perspective, suffering endured with patience and faith can lead to immense spiritual growth, purification, and ultimately unimaginable reward in paradise. So much so, the traditions say people will feel they never underwent suffering at all. Under atheism, suffering just is. It has no redemptive purpose.
A completely different framework for understanding hardship. Okay, another major challenge. Hasn't science disproved God? How does the book tackle that claim?
It starts by reiterating science's limits. Science deals with the observable, the testable. It cannot deny what cannot be observed. It can provide evidence relevant to philosophical arguments, but it can't step outside its empirical boundaries to make definitive statements about the non-empirical.
So it identifies some specific false assumptions often made.
Yes, several. One is the claim, all truth must be scientifically proven. As we touched on, that statement itself isn't scientifically provable, so it's self-defeating as a purely scientific principle. It's a philosophical stance.
Right. What else?
The idea that science is the only path to truth. This ignores other valid ways we gain knowledge. Reason, logic, intuition, personal experience, testimony.
Like knowing who your mother is through testimony.
Exactly. Another assumption is that because science is successful, its current conclusions must be absolutely true. The book points to history like the phlogiston theory, showing that successful scientific models can still turn out to be wrong or incomplete.
So even today's theories are provisional.
They're seen as our best current approximations, work in progress. Think about quantum mechanics and general relativity. Our two most fundamental physics theories actually contradict each other in certain domains. Science is always evolving.
And the problem of induction again. Hume's point.
Yes, the assumption that nature will continue to behave uniformly as it has in the past is necessary for science. But science itself can't prove that assumption without circularity. It's a foundational belief underlying the scientific method.
That leads to the distinction between methodological and philosophical naturalism, right? Can you unpack that again?
Sure. Methodological naturalism is just science's method, explaining natural phenomena using natural causes without invoking the divine. It's practical for doing science.
Like a ground rule for the game.
Exactly. Philosophical naturalism is a belief system, a worldview, the belief that only natural causes and entities exist, period, that there's nothing beyond the physical. The book argues that atheists often slide from the method into the belief system, treating philosophical naturalism as proven fact rather than an act of faith.
And this philosophical stance can blind people.
It argues it can, making it harder to account for things that don't easily fit a purely physical explanation, like consciousness or objective morality, those recalcitrant facts.
Are there other limits to science mentioned?
Yes. Science cannot test the personal. Your subjective feelings, intentions, love, or acts, you can't put those in a test tube. And critically, science answers how, but it cannot answer why.
The tea analogy.
Right. Science can explain how the kettle boiled the water, the physics, the chemistry. It can't tell you why your friend made you the tea, the intention, the care, the purpose behind the action. Those are different kinds of questions.
That really helps clarify what science can and can't do in this conversation. Okay, let's move towards the end by looking at the impact of Prophet Muhammad and the lived experience of Islam as the book presents it.
This section highlights the Prophet Muhammad's character, his unparalleled levels of tolerance, forbearance, and humility.
Are there specific examples?
Several. His response when asked to curse enemies: "I was not sent to curse, but as a summoner and as a mercy." Anas ibn Malik serving him for 10 years without ever hearing a harsh word. The incident with the Bedouin who grabbed him and demanded goods, and the Prophet's calm, generous, even amused response.
It paints a picture of remarkable patience and compassion.
It does. And his teachings emphasize love, universal charity, every act of goodness is charity, good character, humility.
And how did this translate into interactions with non-Muslims?
The teaching, "He who hurts a non-Muslim under protection hurts me," is central. Jurists like Al-Kharafi elaborated on the covenant of protection, emphasizing the duties Muslims had towards protected non-Muslim minorities: kindness, protection, ensuring their welfare. It was an active responsibility.
And this had a historical impact.
A massive one, the book argues. It led to a period of unprecedented tolerance, progress, and justice in Islamic civilization, from roughly 800 to 1600 CE, comparing bustling, learned Cordova with its streetlights to much of contemporary Europe, really highlights this.
And thinkers and leaders from that era influenced the world.
Immensely. The book quotes Jack Weatherford on the foundational contributions of Arab mathematicians to modern technology, and figures like Suleiman the Magnificent influencing notions of tolerance and civic leadership.
How does this connect back to truthfulness and testimony?
It circles back to that idea of testimonial knowledge. Remember denying your mother.
Right. Accepting fundamental truths based on reliable testimony.
The argument is, given the Prophet Muhammad's documented character, his transformative impact, and the consistency of his message, denying his testimony about God requires rejecting the very basis of how we accept most foundational knowledge. Historian William Draper is quoted affirming the Prophet's immense positive influence and concluding he was speaking the truth.
What about the actual practice of Islam, the daily life?
The book touches on the 5 pillars as the basic framework: the declaration of faith, prayer, charity, fasting, pilgrimage. But it also emphasizes reflecting on God's constant innumerable favors, like your heartbeat, ticking away reliably without you even thinking about it as a source of gratitude.
And divine love, how is that understood?
It explores different facets of God's love through specific Quranic names and concepts. There's Rahma, God's general, all-encompassing mercy and compassion for all creation. There's Rahim, a more specific active mercy for those who respond to him. And Al-Wadud, the loving, indicating a special, affectionate, giving love. It's multi-layered.
So obedience to God in this context isn't about blind submission.
Not at all. The book stresses it doesn't mean suspending reason. Reason leads you to recognizing the truth. Obedience then becomes a consequence of that recognition, stemming from awe, love, and gratitude, leading to willing servitude. It concludes that if someone feels no natural inclination to praise the Creator, it might indicate a spiritual disease, like ego, for which Islam is the medicine.
Wow. We've covered an incredible amount today. From the basic questions of existence through atheism, arguments for God, challenges like suffering, the role of science.
It really has been a deep dive, exploring the philosophical, the historical, the existential dimensions of belief and non-belief, particularly through the lens of the divine reality.
Yeah, thinking about how it tries to connect the head and the heart, challenging assumptions on all sides, it leaves you with a lot to think about, doesn't it? About logic, intuition, purpose.
Definitely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with, drawn from the book's wider message, is this idea of distinguishing between our drama, our personal struggles, our limited understanding, our negative experiences, and our reality, the bigger picture, the deeper truths.
Seeing beyond the immediate difficulties.
Sort of, and acting on that by trying to repel negativity with goodness, seeking connection even when there's disagreement. The Quran has that beautiful verse, "Repel evil by that deed which is better, and thereupon the one who between you and him is enmity will become as though he were a devoted friend."
Transforming conflict through goodness, that's a powerful aspiration to reflect on. How might approaching life that way, focusing on the better action, change how you interact with the world and its challenges? Something to really ponder.